this introductory remarks, I asked my staff if I needed to be witty or clever in any way. They said, no, just be yourself. But I'm very pleased to introduce General Chiarelli, 32nd Vice Chief of the U.S. Army, a soldier's general who's previously served as commander of the multinational force and corps in Iraq. Throughout his career, he served in Army units throughout the world and has commanded at every level from platoon to corps. He and his wife Beth have been very strong advocates for our wounded warriors and for improving the behavioral health services for our soldiers. And as we've heard earlier this morning, such services are essential for the transition and the successful transition to employment. So I'm very honored today to introduce General Chiarelli, 39 years in the U.S. Army. General Chiarelli.
Thank you, sir. Feels like I just joined yesterday. Well, good afternoon. Thank you, sir, for that kind introduction. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to join you all. Congressman Edwards, I know you're here someplace, sir. It's great to see you, sir. This is truly a terrific forum. I've already gotten some feedback, and it's focused on a very, very important issue. And that is the reintegration of America's servicemen and servicewomen, and in particular, those serving in the reserve components. As Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, I deal with a wide array of programs and problems. Simply stated, I'm the guy who's supposed to worry about everything. And I worry about it. And as you might imagine, I worry about a lot of different stuff. That said, there is no question that my number one priority is the health and well-being of the force. The rest is important. The network, improvements made to our fleet of combat vehicles and other equipment, cost-saving initiatives for sure. However, unlike the Navy and Air Force, which are platform-centric, and I'm not in any way knocking the Navy or the Air Force, I'm just saying they are more platform-centric, the United States Army is, in fact, people-centric. We're a people-centric force. And the rest simply won't matter if our people aren't cared for properly. What I'd like to do this afternoon is discuss a couple of challenges related to the health and well-being of our soldiers, Army civilians, and family members. And then I'll open it up for questions. I'd like to hear from you. What issues do you see from your perspective? What ideas do you have that might help us all? I'd like to start the discussion by showing you a slide with 3 pictures. If I asked you which of these soldiers suffered an injury while serving in Iraq or Afghanistan, how would you answer? The female in the middle left lost a leg, which has since been replaced with a prosthesis. The young man on the left sustained burns to more than 40% of his body and has undergone several reconstructive surgeries. Now, what about the soldier on the right? Most will probably conclude he's one of the lucky ones who came home unscathed. But that's not the case. The reality is this individual represents many, like him, who are suffering from the invisible wounds of post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. These injuries are affecting a significant portion of our population. In fact, as of 1 September, 66% of our most seriously wounded soldiers were suffering from post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury. I frequently refer to them as the signature wounds of this war. And the fact is, there are many others affected who are not enrolled in our Army Wounded Warrior Program or have yet to be diagnosed. We must get a handle on this. The reality is, as we continue to draw down in Iraq and eventually in Afghanistan, we're going to see more and more individuals return home and stay home for more than 12 to 14 months, many of them dealing with physical and behavioral health injuries, including depression, anxiety, traumatic brain injury, and post-traumatic stress. Of course, we must also consider the possibility that the current wars will end, but a requirement will still exist for large ground forces deployed to other locations around the world. I carry a chart around with me called the failed assumptions chart. It shows the numerous times over the past 10 years when we've made assumptions either about the war or projected force structure reductions and been wrong. And I'm here to tell you we've been wrong 100% of the time. And as the saying goes, expect the unexpected. We must also be prepared for a scenario where, due to an unforeseen contingency requiring ground forces, demand remains high. And our soldiers, many of them dealing with physical and behavioral health issues, don't have the time they desperately need to rest and recover. We'll need to find ways to help them as well. Now take a look at this next chart. As I mentioned, the vast majority of our wounded warriors, our wounded soldiers, are suffering from post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury. And yet most of us don't recognize these injuries when we look at the pictures I showed you. In fact, the injuries we believe are most common, namely amputations and burns, only represent 10% and 2% of the population, respectively. The truth is, because we cannot see these injuries affecting the brain, they don't receive the same level of focus and attention as amputations, burns, shrapnel injuries, and other readily visible wounds. There is simply a bias, and I really mean that. There is a bias, either conscious or subconscious, toward visible wounds and injuries versus those that are not visible. And I would be careful in qualifying that bias. It exists everywhere, including in the medical community. Part of it, I believe, is a lack of understanding of the physiology behind these injuries. And they are, in fact, real, no-kidding injuries, no different than bullet wounds, amputations, or severe burns. That is why nearly everywhere I go, I give a tanker's explanation of these injuries. I will spare you that today. A big part of the challenge is the comorbidity of symptoms. Both post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury may display, for example, symptoms including concentration problems, irritability, personality changes, and memory impairment. We need to better understand how to differentiate between them and most effectively treat them, recognizing that it may very well make matters worse if an individual is misdiagnosed. Certainly, the lack of improvement, or in some cases the worsening of symptoms, can be incredibly frustrating for the patient and for his family members, and underlined family members. Another challenging we're seeing with respect to injuries of the brain is the latency of symptoms. Unlike a broken leg or a shrapnel wound that is immediately apparent and, in most instances may be treated and healed in a relatively short period of time, the latency of symptoms that is common to brain injuries often results in diagnosis and treatment. Unfortunately, the period between when the injury is incurred and when it is actually diagnosed and treated properly can be fraught with related symptoms such as irritability, problems concentrating, anxiety, and depression. NIMH will tell you that from the onset of whatever the element, whatever the incident is that causes post-traumatic stress here in the United States, it's 12 years till someone seeks their first treatment. 12 years. And a bunch of bad stuff happens in that 12-year interval. Fortunately, many of our nation's very best and brightest men and women from academia, industry, and the medical community, nonprofit organizations, DOD, and government as a whole are working tirelessly in this important area. Together over the past decade, we've made tremendous progress in what has been largely uncharted territory with the development of effective protocols, which we put in place downrange, new treatment and imaging methods, therapies, technologies, and protective devices. We've also made great strides within our own ranks. Among our many endeavors in recent years, we've established a pain management task force and campaign plan to adopt best practices Army-wide. We've issued much-needed guidance in critical areas such as polypharmacy management, and in pain management. MedCom, our medical command, recently changed several policies regarding the number of prescription medications and the duration for which a prescription may be considered valid or legitimate. These important changes have led to a decreased use of prescription medications, specifically narcotics and psychotropic medicines across our force. At Walter Reed, for example, Warrior Transition Unit's narcotic usage has decreased from over 80% to 8.5% in the last year and a half among our wounded warriors. Now, this is a good news story, and we're doing our best to replicate it at other Army installations. The problem is having people who are trained in alternative pain management who can work these reductions. This type of challenge will help us to decrease the number of accidental overdoses, medication diversion, and drug abuse. These are important elements of the Army Medical Department's holistic pain management campaign plan. Overall, we've made great progress, and although I could talk for hours about the tremendous efforts by individuals and organizations, that's not to say there aren't problems or areas where there's still significant room for improvement. The reality is, we as a department and as a nation will be dealing with the symptoms and effects of these injuries for decades to come. And make no mistake, this is where your money will be spent. If you're one of those people that's the only thing that turns you on, okay. This is where it's going to be spent. When you look at those numbers, when you look at 66% of my most severely wounded soldiers have traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, that is where you're going to be spending your money. Now, this should be familiar to you. We learned many lessons coming out of Vietnam. We've all seen images of veterans, penniless, homeless, living under bridges. That was and is unacceptable. The reality is, these are not new injuries or injuries unique to this war. They've been around since before the Civil War. And we know this from research that's been done on the topic of post-traumatic stress. For those of you who have not seen it, I highly encourage you to watch the HBO documentary War Torn, 1861 to 2010. It provides an amazing account of the impact of these injuries on individuals in past wars. There's a segment of film with a group of World War II vets that is especially interesting, particularly for someone like me whose father fought in the war and would never talk of his experiences. Now, I'd like to show you a short clip, well, humorous, also gets to an important point in my opinion. It's part of a routine by the late comedian George Carlin.
I don't like words that hide the truth. I don't like words that conceal reality. I don't like euphemisms or euphemistic language. And American English is loaded with euphemisms because Americans have a lot of trouble dealing with reality. Americans have trouble facing the truth. So they invent a kind of a soft language to protect themselves from it. And it gets worse with every generation. For some reason, it just keeps getting worse. I'll give you an example of that. There's a condition in combat. Most people know about it. It's when a fighting person's nervous system has been stressed to its absolute peak and maximum, can't take any more input. The nervous system has either snapped or is about to snap. In the First World War, that condition was called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language. 2 syllables, shell shock. Almost sounds like the guns themselves. That was 70 years ago. Then a whole generation went by, and the Second World War came along, and the very same combat condition was called battle fatigue. 4 syllables now. Takes a little longer to say. Doesn't seem to hurt as much. Fatigue is a nicer word than shock. Shell shock. Battle fatigue. Then we had the war in Korea, 1950. Madison Avenue was riding high by that time, and the very same combat condition was called operational exhaustion. Hey, we're up to 8 syllables now. And the humanity has been squeezed completely out of the phrase. It's totally sterile now. Operational exhaustion. Sounds like something that might happen to your car. Then, of course, came the war in Vietnam, which has only been over for about 16 or 17 years. And thanks to the lies and deceit surrounding that war, I guess it's no surprise that the very same condition was called post-traumatic stress disorder. Still 8 syllables, but we've added a hyphen. And the pain is completely buried under jargon. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll bet you if we'd have still been calling it shell shock, some of those Vietnam veterans might have gotten the attention they needed at the time. I'll bet you that. I'll bet you that.
You know, the person who tried to educate America about battle fatigue after World War II was none other than Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy got hooked on a sleeping pill called Percodil and locked himself in a hotel room in Denton, Texas for over a week so he could get himself off of it. And he went around the nation to veterans groups talking about what was called battle fatigue back then. He did not have a lot of success in raising awareness. Now, to overcome the stigma that exists related to these invisible wounds and to avoid the same outcome on the other side of this war, we must continue to study and learn while raising awareness of programs and support services put in place to ensure the men and women who selflessly serve our country are cared for properly in the event they are injured or in need of help. And as the focus of this forum highlights, this is particularly important as it pertains to our reserve component soldiers. The reality is we are able to more effectively influence those soldiers serving on active duty and help to mitigate the stressors affecting them. Conversely, it is much more difficult to do so in the case of individuals not serving on active duty because, as you well know, they are often geographically removed from a support network provided by military installations. They lack the ready camaraderie of fellow soldiers and daily oversight and hands-on assistance from members of the chain of command experienced while serving on active duty. And in many cases, these soldiers have limited or reduced access to care and services. Meanwhile, they are more vulnerable to the challenges of an adverse economy and a troubled labor market, especially for our young people. We are continuing to work this issue very, very hard, and we're not going to rest until we've figured out how to bridge the divide in the reserve component. We're looking for further ways to expand the reach and accessibility of the programs and services that are positively impacting the lives of soldiers serving on active duty and their families. This is an absolute priority. That said, we recognize that the best long-term solutions are at the local level, with the citizens of our nation's communities, towns and cities, support networks, colleges and universities, foundations, industry, and healthcare groups. There are private, public, faith-based, civic, governmental, and non-governmental organizations whose sole desire is to care for veterans and their families. Members of the military, to include senior leaders like me, are limited by law in what we can and cannot do with respect to supporting or promoting these organizations. We rely on others to help spread the word and rally around our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, our Marines, and our Coast Guardsmen, so that when a young man or woman leaves the military and returns home to Duluth, Minnesota, or Des Moines, Iowa, we can be certain they'll be embraced by the community and given the support needed to reintegrate back into the lives of those they left behind. Now, I'll quickly mention one final topic, then open it up for questions and discussion. As I mentioned, after nearly a decade of war, our soldiers are feeling the effects, and many will be dealing with the injuries they sustained for decades to come. And this clearly represents a readiness issue. Consider, since January of 2008, the number of soldiers in the Army's Disability Evaluation System, or DES, has increased 169% to right around 20,000. The reality is that number is actually probably closer to double that factor if you figure in the number of soldiers who are not yet enrolled in DES, but are nonetheless non-deployable with either temporary or permanent medical profiles. Some people are going to be given a P4. They will get, which is a permanent profile. They will have that profile for up to 6 months. They will heal and they will enter back into that portion of the service we can deploy. Others won't. They will remain in that population and finally enter the DES. When you take 40,000 soldiers out of the active end strength of the United States Army, that is one of the effects of 10 years of war. That's what happens when you ask less of 1% of the population to fight a 10-year war. Meanwhile, the average time it takes to get an active duty soldier through the disability evaluation system is 373 days. Needless to say, this is too long, and the system is complex, disjointed, and confusing. DOD is continuing to work closely with the Department of Veterans Affairs, along with the military services, to make needed improvements. I will tell you that I am pleased and encouraged to see the level of co-location and collaboration to date. The new Integrated Disability Evaluation System, or IDES, is not perfect. However, it does represent a step in the right direction as we work together to address these issues. All of them affect our readiness, and we must address them accordingly, not simply as an Army or as a department, but as a nation. Certainly, we recognize there will be a requirement to reduce the size of our force in coming days as we work through forecasted budget cuts and the drawdown of forces in Iraq and eventually in Afghanistan. That said, we must make these reductions smartly. Whatever the size of the Army, it must remain highly trained and ready. We cannot accept anything less. As I said in the start of my remarks, history has shown us to expect the unexpected. We must always be ready and prepared when called upon to meet our obligation to the American people, and that is to fight and win our nation's wars. I appreciate the opportunity to join you. Thanks to all of you for what you do each and every day, and now I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.